More details from our U.S. correspondent William Deneslow, who's in New York. So, well, let's start with why the United States actually wanted this to happen and what it means for Russia.
Well, Shahan, when footage started to emerge really over the weekend of those images coming out of Bucha, Ukraine, we heard from Linda Thomas-Greenfield, who's the US ambassador to the United Nations. She said it was a farce that Russia remained on the UN Human Rights Council, saying that it was the height of hypocrisy and was also dangerous for the international community. That was a point very much reiterated by Ukraine's representative at the United Nations shortly before the 193 members of the General Assembly were asked to vote. What he said, the Ukrainian representative, was that a vote in favour of this resolution to suspend Russia would be to save lives in Ukraine and potentially around the world as well. To vote no, he said, would be akin to pulling the trigger. So that was certainly a reason why we saw the United States be keen to table this vote. The European Union representative Olaf Skog saying after the vote that there are obligations that members of the Human Rights Council need to live up to, and simply put, Russia was not doing that. So it remains unclear exactly what this means. If Russia were to be suspended, what this would mean, that they wouldn't have any forceful impact, but they could still sit in on some meetings. However, the Russian representative, speaking of the meeting, suggested that Russia was withdrawing from the council itself, which would have different ramifications. The message from officials at the UN is that they're seeking further clarity as to what exactly Russia's position is.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about what Ukraine's representative had to say, because we obviously hear more information about the situation in that country whenever we hear from officials from Ukraine.
Absolutely. What Ukraine's representative said was that it was a duty, not an option, for Russia to be suspended. He also really likened the Human Rights Council to the Titanic nearing an iceberg, saying it was up to the United Nations to save it from sinking. Of course, that's very similar language we heard from Volodymyr Zelensky earlier this week when he addressed the UN Security Council for the first time since Russia's invasion. And what he said was that the United Nations needed to either adapt, it needed to reform to be able to hold Russia to account, or perhaps it should be dissolved forthright. So very strong messages there coming from Ukraine. And of course, important to add that at the same time, Russia has been very forthright in their rejection of the developments we've seen at the UN General Assembly and how this vote transpired.
And then obviously Russia denying those brutal acts in Bucha. And this, William, is despite some reports saying that Russian troops were actually heard talking and discussing killing civilians in Bucha.
Absolutely right. Some damning evidence coming from some German reports to that very effect that being discussed in the German Parliament. And of course this comes after Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, showed about a minute or two of footage that purportedly shows some of the atrocities that were committed in Bucha that he says were at the hands of Russian troops. He said, speaking to the Security Council on Tuesday, some gory details involving civilians being shot, executed and put into mass graves. Some officials in Bucha saying as many as 300 or so civilians had lost their lives. As far as the likes of the United States are concerned, Ukraine, of course, they say there's absolutely no doubt who is behind these atrocities. Russia, for their part, once again vehemently rejecting it. They said after this vote that this resolution was illegitimate and politically motivated. Of course, we did see, though, those 58 abstentions in the General Assembly, including South Africa. One popular thread and narrative we heard from many of those countries is that they wanted to see more of an investigation. They want to see an independent investigation carried out. They want to see the findings of what exactly transpired in Bucha and other places in Ukraine before taking such an action like going to the General Assembly and suspending Russia from the Human Rights Council.
Yeah, all right, we're going to leave it right there. Our correspondent in New York, William Deneslow.